Hi, I'm Greg Williams, Deputy Global Editorial Director of Wired, and I'm really excited today to be joined by Alison Criscitiello, who's an ice core scientist, and we're going to talk a little bit about why high-altitude ice can reveal so much about Earth's climate. So, Alison, really excited to get into this, but I have a first question to ask you that's super important. We need to know what came first, the climbing or the science?
That's actually a hard question to answer. I think the general answer to that is that my love of these places that I now study came first, and that was through exploring them. I did start climbing ice at a very young age and adventuring in the coldest places I could get to from where I grew up. So that did come first, but I was also super interested in earth science since I was really young. But I really think it was living and working in frozen environments that made me ultimately go back to school to study them.
What made ice cores the thing that you wanted to study?
Yeah, it's funny. It took me a while to get there. I knew the cryosphere, the frozen parts of our planet, were what intrigued me, and I really loved being immersed in them as well. So sort of field component-wise, I knew that was where I was drawn. But I started doing polar oceanography, and it took me a little bit to realize I didn't love being at sea. And I sort of was always longing to be on the ice caps and ice sheets that I was near. So it did take a few years during grad school to get there. And then once I had my first deep drilling season, which was in West Antarctica, it was all over. I knew for sure that was it.
So you made that decision. Why was that? What do you think studying ice cores can actually contribute to our understanding of climate?
Well, I guess there aren't that many things that we can go to on the planet to tell us about long-term climate in the past. Ice cores is one of a few. We have sediment cores and corals and cave records. And so there are others, but each one has unique aspects and each one has strengths and weaknesses. And I think with ice cores, to me, one of the most intriguing things has always been that, when you melt the ice, you don't just have the liquid chemistry of the core, which is telling you about various parts of the environment in the past, but there's the little bubbles of ancient atmosphere trapped in the ice as well. And so we can look at gases, we can look at what was actually the composition of the atmosphere in the past. And that sort of dual component to ice cores was something that I always found alluring.
Sure.
Yeah.
And we can see the past, but what does that tell us about today?
Well, we can reconstruct all parts of past climate from ice cores, but the one that's sort of the most relevant globally, and I think for our collective future, has to do with constraining projections of future sea level rise. So ice cores are, I would say, our very best way at constraining future projections of that.
Okay. Yeah. So I'm really keen to get into some of your expeditions. But first of all, I just would love you to describe for us, what are the challenges of actually drilling ice cores? That sounds like a very tough undertaking.
Well, it does depend where you drill them. A lot of the work I do is at the poles.
Yeah.
And that has its own set of challenges. But some of the work that I do in high mountain regions and at altitude between the poles, I would say, is even more challenging because of the additional component of having to deal with altitude. So there's sort of the logistical pieces of getting something frozen from a super remote and high altitude place back safely to a lab. And then there's also sort of the human piece, the safety of the team and getting to and from these really difficult to get to places.
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to learn more about the expedition to Mount Logan. So you're up, 18,000 feet, something like that?
Yeah, the drill site was at 18,000 feet.
Okay, so that's quite a logistical challenge. I mean, what are the safety challenges? How do you make people safe? How do you decide who's on the expedition? There's a lot of moving parts there.
Yeah, my Logan expedition was by far the most logistically complicated project I've ever led.
Yeah, and just for clarity for those watching, Mount Logan is the highest mountain in Canada, is that correct?
Yeah, and it's very close to the coast. The things that make it a really good place to drill an ice core make it absolutely horrendous to be. But yeah, in terms of the challenges to live and work at an altitude like that for weeks, which is what it takes to drill a deep core, you have to climb there. We can't just fly to 18,000 feet. You get mountain sickness and have to descend. So there are a few other folks in the world with this kind of dual background, very experienced or professional high altitude mountaineer and ice core scientist. And so that small handful of people came with me.
So how many people on the expedition?
We started as 7 and we ended as 4.
I was about to say, like, to talk us through that, like, what were the challenges? I mean, that's 3 people out of 7. That's a significant drop-off.
Yeah, I know. It doesn't sound great, but it is actually what I had planned for, that about half the people would make it to the end. It took us 9 days to climb from 10,000 feet to 18, and there's some very technical, difficult ice falls to get through and things like this.
And you carrying the drill up there and all your supplies, or are those?
No, that's the other big logistical piece. So as it is, I carry a little over my body weight, usually, just if I was climbing Logan for fun. That's kind of how I start. I can't take more than that, and nobody really can. The drill alone is 900 pounds.
Right.
The generator is 350. So again, we sort of treat it as just a mountaineering expedition, like we're going to climb Logan. But then when we got to the spot on the summit plateau that I identified as the drill site, very small sling loads were dropped from a helicopter. There's one helicopter that sort of has altitude modifications and can fly at 20,000 feet. The payload at that altitude is 300 pounds. So the drill alone was 3 loads to get it in. The generator was 1. And then it was a few more to get in the other camp items, because we couldn't just live up there for 2 weeks and have carried all that extra stuff. There's no way. But we got, I would say, pretty lucky with the weather. Everything came in right as we arrived on the summit plateau. I called as we were sort of cresting onto the summit plateau and instantly started bringing the loads in. And we were drilling the next day, which is pretty amazing. And then, probably goes without saying, but the way out, there's way more stuff to get out. We had over 1 ton of ice on top of all the drilling equipment that was up there, all slung out in 300-pound loads.
So you've got quite a small team, 7 people. Really intrigued to find out, who are they and why are they so vital to the expedition? What are they all doing?
So one, Seth Campbell, he's one of the leading world experts in ground penetrating radar, and he was necessary for picking the drill site. Dominic Winsky, more similar to me, I would say. He has a lot of high altitude experience, and he is the person who's drilled an ice core on Denali. Etienne Gross is my drill engineer, and he is actually the person who built the drill that we used, and he was critical. He can fix things on the drill I can't. And we did have a big motor failure one day, and it was very dramatic, and it would have shut the whole thing down if he hadn't been there. Rebecca Haspel is my personal lifelong expedition and climbing partner, and I basically refuse to do things like this that are very risky without her anymore. She also is a geologist, and she's assisted me in the field a lot, so she's quite good with the drill, and she's really, she's a mountain athlete, and that sort of trust component is very critical. I feel like she helps sort of co-lead these kind of bigger expeditions with me, so she was quite critical. And then last is Brad Markle, who's sort of like myself and Dom Winsky, is an ice core scientist, easily one of the world's best. And he also had some solid high altitude mountaineering experience, and he made it to the end as well. That was the team.
So Alison, we've talked a lot about the logistical challenges of making this happen, but we're talking about human beings here being in an extremely hostile environment for a week drilling, let alone getting up the top of Mount Logan or to the plateau on Mount Logan. Can you just talk a little bit about the physical challenges that you and the team faced?
That staying that high that long was really taking a toll, and I have never stayed that high that long. There's no reason to, so it becomes quite hard to eat and sleep and things. So, but that was the best I think that we could do. It worked out.
And in terms of the actual research itself, you're drilling the ice core, you're removing this physical bit of ice. You said you removed a ton of ice in total, I think?
Yeah, it was over 1 ton.
How do you preserve that ice and make sure it's in the condition that you would wish it to be once it gets back to the lab?
We drill about a meter at a time, and every meter that comes out, we don't do much in the field. We sort of package it as quickly as we can to keep it safe and get it ready to fly. So it's all sort of bubble wrapped and babied as much as you can. I mean, it's getting heli-slung and not dropped, but it gets placed down at the helipad where it's landing and things like this. And we know if there's breakages in that happen on the way, and very, very few.
You get those samples back to the lab. What are you hoping you can tell us about, I guess, like not just the present with climate, but like the future? Like what can we learn from, the past in order to understand how best to mitigate sort of some of the challenges we currently face?
There's a lot of different things that we measure in ice cores that fall into that category. I think one that is sort of visceral, that's a good example, is wildfires. We use ice cores to reconstruct wildfire frequency in the past. And also we can look at the changes in the vegetation that was burning in the past. And so understanding over longer time scales, for example, wildfire history in the Pacific Northwest can help us, of course, to project future wildfire behavior.
Obviously, an expedition to Mount Logan, 7 people, helicopters, huge amounts of equipment, lots of planning. This is not a cheap undertaking. What kind of supports have you received in order to make this research possible?
There's no way that this project could have happened without support from Rolex and National Geographic Perpetual Planet. It is by far the biggest and most complex project I've led to date, and there's zero chance it could have happened without that support. And I think in addition to just the support that made it happen, there's a storytelling component here and a platform to communicate science that I've never had. And it's unbelievably powerful. I think over the last few years, have spent more of my time trying to communicate the science I do than just do it, because it's vital.
Alison, it's been extraordinary talking to you. Thank you so much for sharing your experiences with us. We look forward to following your research, but also hearing many more stories of really extraordinary human endeavour. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.